Apologize for last week. I thought I'd sent the message out. Apparently had not. Not apparently. Obviously had not. So I apologize to anybody who was expecting me to be here and I failed you. All right. So we can pick up where we left off last week if you want, Seth. If you want to tell us wherever that was, or this is solid ground. We can go back to what we were doing the week before, or we can do something completely different. Now for something completely different for those who know the Monty Python.
Yeah, there was more questions about Adam and Eve, like why was the fruit good and evil?
Okay. So actually, let me hold on that one because I forgot. I already promised to go back here first, so we'll do that and then this.
Eventually.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Okay.
And like the other topic was, like when you're listening to someone or watching a YouTube video, like, do you have a checklist of things they do or don't do that, like, you make them more or less trustworthy, like in your mind?
Right. As in, like, basically, how
do you judge it?
Yeah. What are your biases? What are your filters? What are your judgment points? Okay. Well, let me hand the floor to you to start with, and then we'll get these as they flow.
A topic different from knowledge. So 4 weeks ago, I asked a question. There are some, there seems to be some differences, right? Disagreements between modern Western values that we hold there versus what appears to be biblical values. I raised the example of slavery.
Yep.
David taking 100 foreskins in battle, 15 foreskins, concubinage.
Yes.
And you mentioned at the time, keep in mind that just because theologians believe, medieval theologians believe that just because God didn't explicitly disapprove of that doesn't mean he approves.
Yes, right.
Not everything, well, the narrative, the events of the Old Testament are already after Adam. It's no longer God's first plan.
Right.
So,
yes.
And I take that to mean, so God would have to respond to sinful people, disobedient.
Yes, that's right.
Then that causes a chain of events. Today, can we review some of God's laws for the Israelites right out after their Exodus? Because, okay, what David did, taking 100 foreskins, David did that, but then God didn't say do it. Right? Here, these are God's laws. Right? These are the words of God. And I still find some of them to be in disagreement with what we believe are right and just. So the question then is, are we wrong?
Right.
Or
right.
Are we going to apply what you said, okay, this is God, it's not God's first plan. But then the second plan, third plan. But then the question becomes, at what point then is God accommodating sin?
Right.
Can a perfectly just, perfectly good God accommodate sin?
I should have been writing some of this down because we have some good
and
the flow that you. Let me back up a second. So like OT, we're in a different color here for some reason. There we go. OT laws versus modern or new T. Okay. And I think your second point, all right, is God accommodating?
Of sin and evil. And the answer should be no.
Well,
the answer should be no, because when you compromise or accommodate evil, especially given.
So tell me what you mean by that, because I actually want to be provocative, if you don't mind. I'm going to say yes, God does accommodate evil, but I'll explain what I mean by that. First, tell me what you mean by accommodating. I'm assuming a definition of accommodating.
Giving laws that say set parameters for acts that are inherently sinful. For example, we will come across. I'll read from.
Technically, anything God does sets the parameters for possible evil. And because Paul says this, right? Where Paul says, "I wouldn't have known what sin is without the law." And so he asked the question, is the law bad? Is God facilitating evil by telling people what's right? Because by telling people what's right, it presents them with a moral choice. Oh, you may not have even considered this. However, what you're doing is wrong. Now, from any point forward, from this point, if you choose to do this, now you're doing intentional evil, which is a greater thing. And so Paul was trying to respond to people who are saying, well, if that's true, then the law is temptation, and God's tempting people, and that can't be right. So it depends on, right, it depends on what your definition is.
My definition is, I'll give an example.
Okay.
This is from Exodus 21.
Okay.
I'll start from the beginning. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the seventh he shall go out free, paying nothing.
Yes.
If he came by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he came married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free, then his master shall bring him to God, parentheses, the judges as his agents. He shall bring him to the door or doorpost. He shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him for life. I'll skip a couple. And
That's right. We have it up here too on the screen.
oh, okay. What do we?
So let me, who was it that said it's not heresy as long as it's phrased in the form of a question in solid ground? Whoever said that, isn't it?
So
my favorite thing.
What I mean by accommodating is, well, if you set these parameters for how you buy a servant, giving a woman as a wife, giving,
yes,
you have the right to give, and you can keep that the wife and the children. That seems to say those acts are in of themselves permissible, right? But you just work under these provisions.
Yes.
So then, okay, a master can own, we can have then indentured servitude,
yep,
up to 6 years.
Yes.
It's permissible, it's not sinful.
Right.
And
but lifelong slavery here is permitted.
Keeping the wife and children,
yep,
in servitude is not sinful.
Yep.
And later on, there's one about striking a servant.
Right.
Paraphrasing, if you kill the servant, right, or cause him serious injury, he can't get up in a day or two, that would have to be punished or avenged. But if he does get up in a day or two, then there's no penalty for the master because the servant is his money or his property.
Yes, yeah.
And so then I have to understand then this to me that for this is saying that God does not see indentured servitude of this sort as inherently sinful. Otherwise,
why would he give rules around it?
Right? He wouldn't give rules around murder. He
yep,
wouldn't give rules around dishonoring parents.
Yes.
He wouldn't give rules about setting parameters for coveting.
Yes.
He wouldn't, and so on and so forth. And I want to say, I have no problem believing that the Ten Commandments are God's laws. It's by the time we get to Exodus 21
yep,
that I'm beginning to suspect that are these God's laws or are these ancient Israelites trying to justify their own culture, which is not
right,
particularly unique in the ancient world. But
right. Well, and to your point there, I'll give you the one New Testament verse that I think lends some credence to the thought there. Maybe not, doesn't go as far as saying this is some sort of retrovision of where historically ancient Israelites are trying to justify it in terms of God-delivered rules. But consider what Jesus says when asked about divorce. You remember how he frames it?
yes.
Right? So he says, Moses allowed you to do this. Now, if you go back to the law giving here, it sounds like all the law is coming down from God. And so it's not Moses giving the law about divorce. It's God giving the law about divorce, and Moses just handing it to the Israelites. Right? That's what it sounds like. So we have to ask ourselves a question of which one are those. But I would like to, before we do that, with your permission, let's explore a couple things in terms of our modern sense of morality, actual morality, and God's morality. So first, let me make a point to frame it all. Does God accommodate sin? And is it right to do so? I'm going to say God does accommodate people who are sinful. And in doing so, he accommodates not sin itself, but he accommodates people who are not ready to go from 1 to 0, but 1 to 100 in terms of speed. So let's imagine the following. Let's talk basic education. How many people in here were taught the model of the atom with a nucleus of protons and neutrons, and orbiting around them in shells are electrons, right? All right, so everybody learned this. Do you know that that's completely false? Completely false. Like, does not work. Doesn't even work for a billionth of a second. Does it not work? So that model, we know for a fact, doesn't work. Absolutely wrong. And not even wrong, it's so wrong it's not even right. It's so right that it's not even wrong. It's so off it's not even wrong. That's kind of the idea behind it. The reason that we teach that, though, is not because we're like, how can we lie to a bunch of kids? The reason that we teach it is, if you use that model, it's closer to the truth than, let's say, the next biggest competing theory. So the ancient Greeks were asking the question, if you took a bar of lead and you cut it in half, and then you take that half and you cut it in half, and you keep cutting forever, do you always have lead? Or at some point, do you get something else? And the atomists, where we get the word from, or I guess they got their name from where we get the word from, are the ones who are like, no, at some point when you cut lead, you get something different. And that's some sort of fundamental construct stuff. And that turned out to be the correct view. I think Aristotle was a person who believed more in the continuum, that if you kept cutting it, you get lead forever. So those are kind of like two views out there. And the first thing, when you ask somebody to think about what's the nature of reality, all humans have ever done is come up with those two options. It's like either made of something fundamental and distinct, or it's the same thing all the way down. So the first thing you do if you're going to tell somebody how the universe is, and those are the first two thoughts that occur to them, is you say it's not this one, it's this one. And so the Bohr-Rutherford model of the atom that you learned is an early model of the atom that started our view, so to speak, on how this works, and it worked really, really well with the periodic table of the elements. It explained very clearly why noble gases do this thing, and why these metals are super reactive. Like if you touch this metal with water, it catches on fire. If you touch this metal with water, it explodes. And if you touch this metal, start to touch this metal with water, it explodes highly energetically. And the explanation was this outer valence shell has, one electron that's just ready to spring off at any given time. And over here on the noble gases, the outer valence shell is completely full. And so that's why it doesn't react with anything. And so you're like, oh, okay, this makes sense. It's like there's locks on the doors, or there's different energy potentials sitting on the out there. This makes good sense. But that's not true. So it's closer to true, but it's not strictly true. But if you're going to teach a ninth grader how models work, and what you say is, okay, there's a wave function, or how atoms work, and you say there's a wave function, and electrons we treat them like point particles, but in reality, they're probability distributions. Okay, you know what a probability distribution is? Don't worry about it. I'll tell you that in a second. So probability distribution is this thing. It's spread out this particular way. When you put multiple ones in there, the probability distributions affect each other in a way that is difficult to understand, and it takes some extremely advanced math in order to even model it. But don't worry about it. This is what it looks like. And when you put them together, by the way, atoms don't act like atoms. It turns out that the molecules displace these electron distribution clouds in such a way that the molecules themselves act like completely different constructs than they do in their individual atoms, and that you have to put all that into consideration when you're doing low-level chemistry. Every ninth grader in the room you've lost them completely. You have to accommodate ignorance. It's not the ninth grader's fault that they're ignorant, right? They got a brain. It wasn't blank, but it had certain information in it. We're trying to explain to it how the physical universe works. And if you start off with quantum theory and explain and probability distributions and molecular structures versus atomic structures, even though that's more true than this Bohr-Rutherford model of the atom, none of them are going to learn anything. But there 1 in 10,000 of them are going to learn something. The rest of them you're going to lose. So what you do is you walk them a step at a time. Now, does that mean that you're lying to them? Were your teachers lying to you when they said, this is how the atom works? It depends on what they said. What they should have said was, this is the Bohr-Rutherford model of the atom. It's a simple model of the atom that works well for how we deal with chemistry. It's not strictly correct, but it's really good to learn here. And if you go and do further study in there, you'll learn more about how the atom actually works. And the cool thing about doing that is the kids that are really interested in it will now be inspired to maybe figure out what the real model of the atom is. But you taught them something that's a good representation, but it's not strictly accurate. And I'm not saying this is the right way to teach knowledge. Maybe that's wrong, but it is the way that we do it, and we think that it's okay. So in terms of if you got somebody, like how morally bad are the Israelites at this point? I'll remind you that one of the priests thought it was appropriate that when he sent his concubine outside and she got raped by everybody in the village and killed, and he told her in the morning, like, get up, and she didn't get up, he was like, you know what I'm going to do? This is completely wrong. And you're like, yeah, when did you figure that out? But he's like, no, you don't understand. It's way wrong that these guys did this. I'm going to cut her into 12 pieces and send her out to all my buddies and let them know how bad this was, and we'll come and kill all these guys as a result. That's the level of morality we're dealing with at this point. They are at close to zero. So if you turn around and say, here are the highest ideals of how we should interact with each other, here are these ethical principles, here are all these structures that we have maybe in the modern world, which, by the way, let me ask you the question, do you think that we're more just nowadays than we were back then? So in terms of total justice done.
But that is my question, right?
Yeah.
So that if we say yes, then what are the implications? We're saying we're more mature than the Israelites. Even though we're the same species, we have the same flaws as human beings. It's just been a few thousand years.
Great. Then you're asking the right question. Then since that's the question that you're asking, let me point it. Let's do this the hard way, because that's how we roll on solid ground. What's wrong with slavery? What's wrong with slavery?
That is my question. If God is saying slavery is not a wrong issue, then
why do we think something's wrong with slavery? But why do we feel something's like, if I say, you know what, slavery is okay. Everybody in this room is you're physically going to tense up.
And that's my essential point. I'm trying to point back to God. So shouldn't we obey God absolutely, completely so? What is the word of God?
Okay, but you're going to step 3. I want to go to step 2. Step 2 is, why is slavery wrong?
Because God.
Yeah.
Well, in my just sort of blank opinion, if I'm the master, there's nothing wrong with slavery. If I'm the slave, it's not good at all.
Well, some people think that it's good.
Well,
I love my master and my wife and children. I do not want to go free.
Oh yeah, I guess if I've got it good.
Like, in order for a guy to be enslaved for life in Israel, you had to make that statement.
Right.
I don't want to be free.
So are we including indentured servitude, or are we just talking strictly slavery, compelling someone against their will?
All of them.
Okay, and it strips down your moral file. It breaks you down to just a unit of work. You do not have a personality. You do not have feelings. You are just someone. Go make my eggs. Go throw hay to all the horses, and that is as far as you look at it.
So is that different than the way corporate America treats their employees?
No, it's not.
You can quit.
Like
You can quit.
You can quit. Yeah.
it depends how you get treated. That's what makes it good or bad. Because we are slaves now over a lot.
Okay, so, but, yeah, you're going to step 3. I want to stay at step 2 first. You're getting too advanced for me. Is a Marine a slave? The United States Marine, is he a slave?
You can't quit that one.
You can't leave before your contract or an XYZ circumstance. So it's an indentured servitude, but, right, so, and we can still ask the question, is that right or wrong by God's standards?
Yes.
But then it's the the military is only a small fraction of society in this special world.
Fine, but the bottom line is, when our society, not only do we accept it, we glorify it. I was a Marine, right? I joined the Marine Corps for all the wrong reasons, like every Marine probably does. But the bottom line was, you're tendered a significant amount of respect for making yourself an indentured servant. I'll tell you one thing, I didn't feel like an indentured servant. It feels like you're being a slave in the Marine Corps. Because they didn't care about your person. You don't have a personality. Your personality had better conform to the Corps. When they cut you, you better bleed green and gold. And if you don't like it, on ship, they just got rid of this. On ship, they can reduce you to bread and water and confine you in the brig for 3 days at a time. So, like, there's stuff, and by the way, Marines get beat up a lot. And the rules are the same, by the way. Like, hey, if you guys got in a tiff and one guy beats the other guy and he gets up in a day or so, it's probably fine. But if you really broke the guy, there's probably going to be some proceeding, some sort of non-judicial punishment or something like that. It looks an awful lot like what's going on in here, okay? Yeah, so it's easy for us to turn around and say, look at those guys, that's terrible. But if you go by and you look at the folks who are working at McDonald's right now, and I don't mean the kids who are doing it as a summer job, but who their professional career is, I'm the teller at McDonald's, and you say, why are you not just doing something else? Their answer is, nobody will hire me to do anything else. I'm doing the best that I possibly can. Like, we have social strata that are difficult to get out of. And I'm not saying that's slavery, but I am saying that not everybody's free. Like, this is America, right? We're as free as we're going to be in kind of a human system. But not everybody is as upwardly mobile as everybody wants to say that we are in America. And I'm as pro-America as anybody's going to be. But it's not true that anybody in America can do anything. That's never been true of humanity anywhere. There are 99.9% of Americans will never be a nuclear physicist. It doesn't matter how bad you want it, you're just not equipped to do it. And the same turns out to be true of education and background and capital and all those other kinds of things.
Well, the New Testament talks about like a worker entitled to their wages. So the master is not providing, at least to the level of what their wages would be.
They definitely are. Who clothes the slave? Who feeds the slave? Who gives them shelter? This is all responsibilities of the master. Right. These are things that they do. One of the things that we think about. So, what's a form of slavery where you give away your personal freedom that we think is really, really good? Marriage. Okay, consider what you have done. You have looked at another person and you have said, I will not have one of the most fundamental relationships that human beings have, this intimate relationship that the evolutionists will tell you is one of the only two things that you're doing, surviving and reproducing. I'm going to give up 3.5 billion options for one, forever. And I promise it. And in fact, the way that we think about it is, we're not even going to get emotionally involved with another person of the opposite sex to the degree that you would even consider them too closely familiar. Because we would call it, people will now use a term for that of like emotional cheating or emotional adultery today, right? That's how closely we bind ourselves in this relationship. So if the question is, hey, look, you have this group of freedom, you have this set of freedom out there, and you're significantly reducing it by being a slave. The same is true of marriage. Okay, it is a trade-off of, these are all of the rights and powers and potentials that I have. I'm going to constrict them for some given purpose. By the way, that pattern is all that you do in this physical world. Let me prove that to you. That's not just marriage. If you set your sight on a goal, so you're free, pick your goal. I want to be an Olympic runner. Guess what you just gave up? Everything about your diet, everything about your personal schedule, your freedom to just, I don't feel like it today. Gone. You don't get to do that anymore. Not if you want it. You're giving that up. And instead, you're also going to pay a guy to yell at you, to go faster and to get up, right? So we turn around and we choose what we want. And whenever we choose what we want, we choose our chains. That's one way of thinking of it. Whenever we choose what we want, we choose our path. But paths require discipline. And discipline is where you get rid of things that you otherwise could have had in pursuit of the thing that you want. Now, if that's the right construct, if that's the way the world works, okay, here's all the things you could do, but you're going to choose what you want to do. And in choosing what you want to do, you will give up all these other things. You choose to be a physicist, you're probably giving up being an NFL football player. You choose to be a construction worker, you're probably giving up being a adventurer who goes out and travels the world in his kayak. Right? There are different things that you're going to give up. In fact, you give up most things. In fact, you give up almost everything by what you choose. What becomes the main question? What should you choose? Right? What should you choose? Or maybe the question before that is, why do I have to give all this stuff up? So why do we have to give up other things?
It depends on how badly you want the thing you're choosing.
Well, but if you want to be a physicist and a world adventurer and a writer and a chemist and
limited resources, limited time.
Limited resources and time. Why does God have limited resources and time? No, he could be anything he wants. What did he choose to be? That's the ultimate question. We'll get to that later. So your thing.
This goes back to Genesis 1. Okay? God said, you're free to pick anything you want, to choose anything you want, but you cannot pick this. So, I can sit here and look at my life and say,
actually, he didn't say you cannot pick this. What he said was,
if you do, there's consequences. Okay, so that goes back to responsibility versus freedom.
Yeah.
People say, it's like, we own our own business. Oh, you're free to do anything you want. No, bitch. I've got vendors, I've got employees, I've got family, I've got customers.
The closest thing I've ever seen to a modern slave is a modern entrepreneur. He is an absolute slave to the company, right?
Yeah, tell me I'm free. But if I go the other direction and I say, okay, I'm going to be a hermit, I'm going to be a monk, I'm going to sit out here on this rock.
Yes.
Well, I'm not free because now I can't do all the other things.
Right.
So it's like we're not born into freedom. Somewhere along the line, I guess, there's kind of this relationship between our sin, our wanting to be away from God, and our giving up of freedom. Because, we're free to choose, but there are consequences with that decision that we make.
Now, I'll throw the answer
out.
So
we're locked in this.
Yes, I'll throw the answer out here briefly, and then we'll discuss and hopefully come back to it. But there's a reason that God limited us so much. And the reason God limits us so much is he wants us in 70 years to be able to discover the truth. Now, let's go. I like what you said. This goes back to the garden. When you're a wildly successful entrepreneur, when you're a wildly successful business person, when you're wildly successful at life, what do you do? When you have gained all the power you possibly can, what's the goal? What's the goal of most Americans? Even if they succeed. Independence. And in retirement, what do they do?
Leisure.
What kind of leisure? Like, what's the kind of, like, what was the dream? What do most people dream of?
Doing whatever you want.
Sitting on the front porch, sitting on a beach somewhere in the Caribbean. Just sitting there with the average person's like with a margarita in my hand on the beach, watching the sunset. Like you hear people say that all the time. What did we have in the garden? Right? You're in the most beautiful place on earth. You have limitless food, and you have and for those who are pursuant of knowledge, you have access to the most knowledgeable being in the entire universe, in all of reality. We were living in retirement, and they were like, this is no good. Let's go make this harder. God's like, all right, you can make it harder if you want to. I'm telling you it's a bad idea. We're like, right, we'll be the judge of that. And, here we are now, and everybody's trying to get back to the garden. Okay. So that's part of the answer is, how's God going to get us back to the garden? But you don't get back to the garden by working hard to get there. And that comes out with two definitions, the latter of which is basic of Christianity. But let's get back to the very answer to your question. And yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'll let you finish. Then can I turn this on its head?
Yes, please. So, after she turns it on his head, if we can still go in that direction, the next question I want to still answer is, why is slavery wrong? Why do we think slavery is wrong? Because we haven't answered that right. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm not feeling comfortable with how we're going at this with specific circumstances, because I remember the medieval time where it's the picture of being where it's God, angels, men, dogs, horses, women, children. And so I'm kind of in an interesting position for that. You know, they have these arguments.
Why do you think dogs are ahead of horses?
Ask my husband when I really ticked him off.
Okay.
But part of it is, I think as human beings, we're really limited on what is good. We all have our conceptions of the garden, and you notice if you talk to people, everyone's conceptions of heaven are a little bit different.
Yes.
I don't think that we're necessarily, we ate the fruit, but I don't think we're necessarily capable still of judging good and evil. Not in the way God is. I'm going to fall back to John and the medieval theologians, because those have helped me, because we have these arguments, slavery, not slavery, and you can see with the Israelites, they're already separating different types of cloth. God's obviously trying to teach them you should treat people certain ways, but that's part of it. We can argue about what a slave is, but I'm a slave to nature, for heaven's sakes. I have to eat, I have to drink. There's things that happen to me, I get sick.
But that's the point I was making here. My point is, in this world, if you're limited, you're already going to be, I guess I was getting to that, which is you're going to be a slave to something. So the real choice is not, are you a slave? I guess she's fast forwarding it. The real choice is not, are you a slave? The real choice is, who's going to be your master?
God, I'm sorry, I'm being too limited. I'll try to get to the point. God doesn't say to the Israelites when he frees them from Pharaoh, which is our clear, this is slavery in the Old Testament. You get to just come out, you get to be free. It's come out and serve me. You get to be free to serve me. And something that's comforted me, because sometimes you read these things and people take them and they make God out to be another form of Zeus. I didn't phrase that as a question. Okay, well, here's our heresy for today. They make God like Zeus, where it's just get my enemies, this is the way it is, you have to go with the system for the sake of mankind, and this is what's good for the circumstance. Or sometimes it's Santa Claus, where I get what I want, and I don't, you know, this is heaven, and this is everything that satisfies my appetites without looking eternally and saying, well, maybe your appetites aren't designed. But John calls God the Word, the Logos.
Yep.
And later on, he calls God love. We have God being called truth.
Yes.
You go back to Thomas Aquinas, and this is something that's helped me, so I don't know how we feel about medieval theologians, but he said God is good. They use the sunum bonum a lot, the ultimate good, which isn't a complete, but we're having trouble. It's almost as if God is good itself, and we don't have a clue what good is, so we can argue all day long about these little things. But the closer we get to God, the closer we get to good, and we are slaves until we get to that good. So it looks like the only way out is to get to that good. And then, gentleman here is right. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Yeah, but hold on, right? Hold on to that, because I don't want to let you're saying enough things that we need to follow up on them, because they each are their own valuable point. Say what you just said again.
God is good.
No, after that. Nope, that we know. What after that?
God is good, so the only way to be free is through conforming to God and becoming like Him and living how He wants to live.
Okay, so now to this point of like, are we accommodating evil? If God's the standard here, and by the way, this is entirely consistent with especially modern Western Christian view. God's up here, and we're so far down here that we can't even see Him, right? That we're worms, we're the worst, God's the best. Like this is take the Calvinistic view where like we can't even start to think right about stuff. If that's true, or even if that's half true, you don't go from here to here in one step. Ever. You don't go from I want to learn how to run to I'm an Olympic runner. You don't go from I'd like computers to being a world-class computer programmer, right? In a step. It takes a long path to get there. And what coaches do, what teachers do, what instructors do, what shepherds do, is they walk you up the role of discipline and complexity until you eventually get to that point. There's an exception to this. Well, it doesn't matter. The exception doesn't matter. But this pathway of progress from across a great delta occurs in some number of increments. Whether you think they kind of are quantized, or whether you think it's a continuum, or whether you think it's this kind of graph, whatever it is, you get from here to there in a number of steps. And those steps require knowledge, and they require discipline. I'll remind you that the 12 are called the 12 disciples. And the disciples are from discipula, and discipula is a Latin word for student, but it's also the word from which we get discipline. Because you couldn't be a student without subjecting yourself to a teaching master and without really constricting what you do to follow this goal of the knowledge that you're trying to gain from the master. So you have to discipline yourself. You have to have self-discipline, and until you have self-discipline, we tend to impose external discipline. You'll see this from in all the things we do as well. Originally, your teachers had to make you do stuff. And then eventually you learn to do them on your own. They gave you the discipline initially, and then you learn to take that discipline on yourself. So in this walk up here, you should expect to see enablement steps that you're like, this is inconsistent with the final goal. You're right. That's not the only thing that we want to do, but you have to learn to do this before you're going to do this. If you can't be a good servant and you can't be a good master, then you won't be able to be a good follower and be a good leader. Now, what's the difference between a servant and a master and a follower and a leader? We're comfortable with follower and leaders, like we do that all the time. Servant and master, we're not. What's the difference? Why is one right and the other one wrong? Somebody tell me.
So this kind of servitude, let's just talk this
yes,
kind.
Yes.
Let's not talk about corporate, military, right? Changing the definition.
What's wrong with this?
This kind of indentured servitude and slavery, perhaps when we get to the passage about eating and slave benefits, what's wrong with this?
Yeah.
If I had to make a biblical abolitionist argument, I would say because it's because God said so. And how do I know God said so? I'll have to take other parts of the Bible. God is love, God is truth, etc. Love thy neighbor.
Yep.
And I'll have to say something along the lines of it's wrong to do that to a person who's made in the image of God. Anti-abolitionists have worked it out quite a lot, arguing with pro-slavery proponents who also cited the Bible. So, but the right answer, the right biblical answer should be because God said it's wrong. But then here, God is making setting parameters that implies that it's permissible. So
but even the biblical, so I will challenge. I agree. I'm agreeing with almost everything you're saying. Let me disagree with something. The right answer to why is never because X said so. That's not the answer. That is part of the answer, but it's not the whole answer. It's asking why is this okay because God said so. That's as unsatisfying an answer as when you say to your parent, why can't I do this? And they're like, because I said so. Right? We're like, that's not the full justification. So my point is this, both God and the Bible, God has reasons for telling us what to do. It's not because he said so. It's not wrong. So if we turn around and say it's right or wrong because God says to do it, we fall into a dilemma, an ancient Greek dilemma called the Euthyphro dilemma. This is one of Socrates. So if you buy off on that, it's right because God says so, then God is subjective what is right and wrong, and that God can pick what's right and wrong. And he could have just as easily said rape is right as he could have said it's wrong. But we don't believe that's the case, nor do we believe it's the case that there's some higher good out there that God's having to adhere to. And so the reason God can't say rape and murder are okay is because even he can't pronounce them okay because he's subservient to those standards. The Christian answer to that is this is a false dilemma, and God is the good, and that what God is doing is because he is the greatest of all possible beings, because he is the greatest good, it's only logical for him to say, be like me in your address, your conduct, and your regard, and then you will have the greatest possible good. And we're like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So I know you're not saying that, but I want to point out, it sounds like you're saying that if the why is because God says so. No, that's the reason that we probably ought to have. But that's the reason, by the way, that the basic Marine, like drill instructors do not explain to basic Marines all of the ethical and tactical intricacies around why they're going to do what they're doing, right? They're like, you will do this right now. And if I'm like, if you, heaven forbid, ask a drill instructor why, could you please explain to me? I don't understand. What do you think his answer is going to be back to you? My apologies. Let me give you a nuanced explanation of why this is, right? You're probably getting in trouble for having the impertinence to even ask him a question. But eventually, we send people to military schools where we explain to them all of the reasons that we march around with rifles like a bunch of idiots, which is no longer necessary, and yet we do it for some reason. And they explain it once you get more mature on all these things. Okay. So, I wanted to make one point on here. In terms of slavery being right or wrong, let me ask you, is it wrong to take someone's freedom from them? I mean, generally speaking, like if I were running around and you were doing something I didn't like, and I said, stop doing what I don't like, and you're like, I don't have to stop doing what you don't like, I'm free. And I'll be like, if you don't stop what you're doing, then I'm gonna jump on you, and I'm gonna bind you, and I'm gonna drag you off. And I'm gonna throw you into a room somewhere until you do what I say. Is that right or wrong?
Depends on the context.
Because that's what cops do, right? Now it sounds like kidnapping and an enforcement of will and a violation of freedom. Yet we pay them and we say, please do this to all of us.
Involuntary psychiatric.
Okay, so what I want you to say is, my point in doing stuff like this, and the point I'm trying to get to is, imagine, and I have had the privilege to see this a little more clearly in virtue of having served in Afghanistan, where, as I heard somebody put it, Afghanistan is Genesis with guns and trucks. It is, and it is. I mean, the social structures there are the same. There are not, in the hinterlands of Afghanistan, there are no police. There are no judges. There is no infrastructure building. There is no tax system. There is no government. The government is the tribal shura council, and that's if the village is big enough to put together a shura. And so you know what happens out there? If one guy does something wrong to the other guy, this guy will go shoot that guy, and everybody will be like, you had it coming. You know, maybe the shura council will meet and be like, well, he didn't really have it coming, so you got to pay him some money. And we're like, he has to pay him money because he killed him? Yeah. So you have to imagine that it's the time of the judges in Israel. Now, this is a short part of the Bible, and we don't think about it too much, and all kinds of crazy stuff comes out of the judges' books. But the bottom line is, no matter how complex your structures are, we have very complex structures for governance and justice in America, very complex. They're operating over the same domain that people were in the judges' time. So whatever principle is here must be here for justice to be there and for goodness to be there. And whatever principle is here must also be here. And what I'll point out to you is, do you think that our modern series of laws are good? What happened to Greece? Does anybody know why the Greek Hellenistic kind of hegemony, I guess it was never a hegemony, but what really brought the Greeks down? Some people have made the argument that it was literally the ability to sue people that got so litigious in there. Like, remember Socrates got killed. Not that Socrates was the greatest good Greece ever saw. He got killed by a popular vote in a trial where the peers just got together and like, we don't like him. We think he's corrupting the youth. He got up and was like, I'm not corrupting the youth. Like, how could you say I don't believe in gods? I'm bringing in foreign gods when I'm literally talking about the sons of gods in here. If there's sons of gods, there must be gods. I must believe that there's a God, right? And the people are like, I don't care, drink poison. Okay, so the same kind of stuff happens in America. We see the exceptions where the trials, people get thrown into the jail for 20 years, didn't do the wrong thing. Do you guys remember this recently came up, do you remember what happened in the 90s with for those of you old enough, with the allegations of Satanism and child sexual abuse in daycare centers? There's a wild spate of people of numerous daycare centers being accused of holding satanic rituals with the children, of wild sexual abuse stuff, orgies, all this kind of stuff with little kids. All of it was completely false. They put people in jail for decades for something that turned out to be a really bad misunderstanding of how you interview a child about stuff that happened, because children being very susceptible to suggestion. Like the people would give them 2 dolls and say, like, show me what happened. And the kids start playing with them and they're horrified. And they're like, oh my goodness, this happened. So, and I'm not talking about like this was a he said, she said stuff. Go back and research it. You'll see there are still people in jail, by the way, today from that. So, and I just realized this recently too. If you're accused of murder in America, accused of murder, wrongly accused of murder, you have to, you can use the public defender, but almost nobody does because the public defenders are like not your best bet. By the time you're done with the trial, it costs $100,000 to $200,000. When you are acquitted, because you didn't do it, who gives you the money back? Nobody. You owe $200,000 to somebody who just proved that you were innocent, that a jury of your peers like, this guy didn't do it, you still owe $200,000. That just ruins your life. Do they go after the person that accused you? Do you get the money back from them? Does the government turn around and be like, oh, good, the process worked, you're innocent, here, from tax money, let us take care of you? That's terrible. That's what we do. Okay? So, this is terrible. Yeah, that's what we do. So, the short answer, I'm trying to say that the reason that we see these interim measures, and the interim measures are how God gets us all the way to the top. Except, unless you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, God gives you this right off the bat. And he does it in two ways. He says this, I gave you all these laws to help you see what the right is. But what is the absolute good? How should we treat our servants? How should we treat our wives? How should we treat our children? How should we treat our dogs and our horses? How should we treat them? What's the answer, Christians?
The way you want to be treated.
Love. Yeah, you treat them exactly the way that you want to be treated. The standard that explains all the things in here is that love is really what you ought to be doing. But then we're like, okay, but I'm way down here and God's way up here. How's God going to get us from here to here? What magic does he do? You're Christians, what's the magic? How does he take you from I'm a sinner and I'm entirely concerned with myself and I do these terrible things to I'm like Christ?
He fills you with the Spirit.
He gives you his Spirit. Now, does that mean that we just overnight, we got it, we don't need milk, we can do solid food? Even in that, there's a progression, right? But at the end of the day, when you if you have had, many of us grew up in the church, and so we don't see this, but have you ever met somebody, did you ever know somebody that went from person A to person B overnight? That's what God does with his Spirit. That's what Jesus came to do. And the kingdom of heaven is a kingdom not ruled by laws and structure and hierarchies. It is a kingdom ruled by all volunteers who agreed to be in the kingdom and do love to and for each other. And so that's the ultimate end goal. Now, I'll bring you up to one more, and then I've been talking way too long. I'll bring you up to one more, but this is a very, I think, interesting part of the Bible that I'm going to forget where it is exactly. So, was it here? Where is okay. I've never remembered a reference other than John 3:16 in my entire life.
We get concordances and find
Yeah, I should do
sections.
that. Where's James talking about? Obviously, it's before he's killed. Where's James talking about what we're going to order? The
Acts 15, the council.
15, yeah.
Yeah.
15. Okay. Read verse 19 to 21 here. This is James talking. It's my judgment, therefore, that we should not cause trouble for the Gentiles. This was the question of, like, do they have to get circumcised? How Jewish do the Gentiles have to be? Do they need to come in and be Jews? Do they need to obey the law? Because the law is good. We obey these guys, by the way, are obeying the law, generally speaking. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not cause trouble for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write and tell them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, and from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. That's a weird set of rules, boys. Where did that come from? Those are the Noahide laws that the Jews believed that God gave Noah. It applied to all nations. So these are the Mosaic laws were for the Jews. The Noahide laws were for everybody. There were 7. These are 4 of them. For Moses has been... Now, look at the next verse. For, why? Because Moses has been proclaimed in every city from ancient times and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. What does that sentence mean? Why is it here?
If they want to find out more, they have resources.
They're at 0. We want them to get to here. Give them the Noahide laws. And when they're ready for it, they can go become more Jewish. That's the idea. Now, the real question is does James have it right here? And do all believers do all Gentiles need to become as Jewish as they possibly can? Now, in one sense, the answer is yes. What was the purpose of being Jewish? It was to set yourself apart to be as one of God's people. Yes, sir?
No,
just scratching. Okay. Then
No scratching your head.
there's no, not around here. And sold. The gentleman that I didn't want the. Yep. This is James, at least, indicating that he believes that Gentiles should follow the laws more because the laws are good.
Problem. Mrs. Scott, I think I understand your thesis to my question. The laws in Exodus 21 and onwards, those, at least some of the laws, let's say the laws on indentured servitude and slavery, they're for an immature people, morally immature people.
Yeah.
Right? They're, as you say, interim laws. But then, what are the implications of saying that? You see, then God gives interim laws. All right. How do we know which ones are interim, which ones are not? Is the first commandment and interim law? Because if you can say that, then though what you call the progressive church can certainly say, well, despite God wiping out Sodom, that's just an interim law.
Yes.
Homosexual, where you talk about that, right?
Yes.
We're more mature now, so that you're taking their doctrine.
This is a very, very good question. So to answer the question, let's pretend that these two tables represent two different kinds of societies. Let's say this society is more advanced, and what I say by more advanced, I mean that you have built structures to enforce these kinds of things, and that, let's say, even though this isn't necessarily the result of it, that the people in here are generally more moral and are generally more discerning about what's right and wrong. These guys are savages in terms of no structure, no real nuance to the right and wrong. Okay? All right, so we've got these two different kinds of societies. In this side right here, all right, person is, Seth and he have a dispute over the land. Yes, sir, go ahead.
So could this be why God is telling us humans are not to judge each other? Because there's this sliding scale of morals and rules that we cannot keep up with. Okay, this person is this savage, like it's on Gomorrah, and we are the Israelites, and so because we see bad, we're going to spank the monkey until they conform to us, even though they don't know why they're doing it.
So while I don't think it's all of the reason why, I think that it's a big part of why. Okay. Because what we'll see here is also true from one person to the next. And that's why I'm trying to say, our most advanced society versus our most primitive society. And by the way, this works within our own societies. It's just different deals of gradation. So yes, I agree with you. Now here's the point. I'll get to it quickly since we're already obviously getting the point. The solution to these two guys have a land dispute. So you guys have a land dispute, right? And by the way, if you don't think that this is a big deal, in Afghanistan, we paid this guy who had done work for this military base a whole bunch of money. In Pakistani rupees, it was this much money. The stack was this high. And that was, a couple $100 or whatever it was. So, of large denomination bills. When he has this money, we're like, what bank do you put it in? He's like, dude, we don't have banks out here. I'm like, okay, well, what do? You don't stuff it under your mattress. And he's like, yeah, we don't really have mattresses out here. What do you do with it? And he's like, we buy land with it. And then when you need to do something else, you sell the land. The land is their bank. What was one of the biggest deals in the Old Testament? Did you remember, he who moves a boundary?
Right.
You're like, what are you talking about? A guy went on to survey, you move the post over? Yeah, you're literally, that's like being a bank robber back then, right? So, because that's what their banks were. So there's a land dispute here, and so this person steals this person's land. What's he going to do about it? There's no judge. There's no court for him to take it to. There's no office of the registrar that he goes and says, let's just get the surveyor out here. What do you do?
Hardly.
Yeah, the only thing you have left is violence.
Retribution.
Which you can threaten, if you don't give me my land back, I am going to come and take yours from you. And if you're going to take it from you, you can't just move the boundary because the guy will move it back again. What do you have to do? You have to beat him up. And if beating it up doesn't work, then what do? Then you kill him, right? That's all that's left. Over here, he moves his boundary. Now what do? Well, you take him to court. And then they send the police out, who, by the way, have guns and batons. And if you resist what they're doing, and you continue to resist, they will beat you, and then they will kidnap you, and then they will hold you against your will. And so same things, but we do it in a more formalized system. Now, what's the right answer in both cases? So imagine that Jesus shows up in either case. These guys are fighting it out, and Jesus shows up and says, could you just do to the other person what you wish they would do to you? And then you're like, yeah, you're right, that's what I should do. And you fix it. Over here, Jesus comes and says, could you just do to the other person what you wish they would do to you? Yep, you're right, I'll fix it. Exact same answer. Most advanced society, most primitive society, same answer. The answer is apply the law of love. So if you want to skip to the end, if you want to be as morally advanced as you can, just love the other person. Not that hard. But it turns out to be extremely hard.
Sorry, not that hard.
It's not intellectually that difficult, but somehow but it's discipline difficult.
The concept, the application is hard.
But why is the application hard? Why is it hard to love somebody else? Why is it hard to love the guy?
Because it's sacrifice.
Right? And what is it that it's this thing that's doing it, and this is what Jesus changes, which is why God can do it by magic. The magic is Jesus fixes it. Why is the magic possible? What do you have to do to allow, what was the passage you were reading? Can I do this? Maybe I can do this. I'll show you the secret if you want to know.
The laws outside of Exodus 21.
Exodus 21. That's the secret. I don't want to be free of what God wants me to do. Nail my ear to the doorpost with an awl. I shall serve my master for life. Now, God is the only master. By the way, even back then, remember what happened with who chief stewards were. So chief stewards were chief slaves in many cases. The chief slave, if you didn't have heirs, or if your heir turned out to be a real dirtbag, the chief servant ended up being the heir of the household. God promises us that when we become his servants, he turns up, what does Jesus say? I've not called you servants, but I've called you friends. Yeah. We have become his heirs because that's what he wants to do in the long run. But you cannot be a son in Christianity or a daughter without being a servant first. Then he frees you and makes you a son or a daughter. But if he made you a son prematurely, then you might come to him ahead of time, like we did in the garden, and say, give me my inheritance. And then we go off and we spend it in wild living. And then we regret it. And then we come back and we say, what? Treat me as one of your hired servants. And then God embraces us and says, bring the ring for his finger, bring the robe, kill the fatted calf.
So, am I understanding correctly that what you're saying is, this is how we determine whether the law is an interim law or not. Right? Apply the law of love. If it's inconsistent with the law of love, then it's an interim law. If it's already fully consistent with the law of love, let's say the Ten Commandments,
yes,
then they're not interim laws. They're laws for all time till the end of days. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's most of what I'm saying. I would only make a couple of adjustments to it, maybe. Even the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are singularly unimpressive as guides to love. Right? If somebody came to me and said, like, I want to know how to treat my husband, or I want to know how to treat my wife, what should I do? And you're like, look, I can make this very simple for you. Don't kill her. Don't rape her. Don't lie to her. You're like, okay, I got that. Can we get a little more nuanced here? Like, the Ten Commandments are not that good in terms of like how we should treat other people. They are the basic level. They're the, if you savages out there don't understand it, you have to stop killing each other over land. All right? Can we just stop killing each other for a second? Can we stop kidnapping each other? By the way, there's some debate as to whether do not steal actually should have been interpreted. Many Jewish scholars believe that's do not kidnap. But bottom line is, neither one of them are good, right? But I would say on the one hand, even the Ten Commandments, yes, it's the case we shouldn't murder. And if what you're saying is, okay, well, it's always the case we shouldn't murder, it's not always the case that we shouldn't have slaves. Like, if that's more advanced, then yes, I grant that that's correct. But my point is, like, the Ten Commandments are not, they are consistent, and so you could say that they are God's laws that shall never be violated. Whereas in the long run, yeah, if we truly love people, well, let me ask you this. Transport all of you into the hinterlands of Afghanistan, or let's say the jungles of Brazil, where you don't have anything at all in terms of structures. And there are a bunch of people in the room, and all of them are going to work in the same society. And not all of you produce things at the same rate. Okay? So the people at the back table out there turn out to be really, really good farmers and craftsmen and all that kind of stuff. And they turn out to be highly productive. The rest of us knuckleheads tried, and all of our crops failed. What are we supposed to do? What do? Do we go to them and just be like, give me some of your stuff? And they're like, okay, here it is. Now we're all half starving. And they go do it again, and we go try something else again the next year. We don't learn anything. We go farm the same way, and we all start starving again, and they're doing really well. How do we fix this? Like, what's the best way to do it?
Tell them to take what they have.
Right? Okay, good. There's a guy that doesn't get it. No, just kidding. Yeah. What's the right thing to do? The right thing to do is for all of us to turn around and say, you understand something I don't understand. Teach me how you're doing it. And your answer is, we teach on the job here. Come and work with me. And then we turn around and we're like, well, I'm going to take over. And he's like, no, you're not. You can't. Remember, you're coming to me. I'm teaching you. Stop trying to mess up what I'm doing, because now we're like, oh, we know how to do this. We're like, and he's like, no, that's the same thing that got all your crops killed last time. And so we start trying to do it. Now, what's he got to do? He's got to stop us from doing it. But there's no courts. There's nothing else. And we start. Then he's going to take a stick and he's going to be like, if you don't stop cutting this trench, which is going to kill all the crops, I'm going to beat you with a stick. Like, that's what you're down to. That's my point. Right? Now, if we're living in the perfect law of love, nobody has to threaten to beat anybody with a stick, because presumably we're humble enough that we're like, I starved last year. Maybe I should listen to this guy. He knows what he's doing. But we always, always, always end up showing up to a place and thinking we know better than everybody else. And we do it, and that's why these structures exist. So what we would do in a society like that is we become his indentured servants. And we agree with him. I'm going to come onto your property and help you out for the purposes of learning and growing. But in order to do so, I have to give something up. And that's my right to tell you what to do with your land, which makes me a servant and him the master. And by the way, the servant-master thing, which we find so odious, we love it in Kung Fu, right? You show up to the place and you subject yourself to the master. And the master has you do all kinds of hard stuff that you don't get, right? Or, I mean, even Karate Kid, right? Paint the fence, wax the car. I'm just your slave. And he starts punching at him. He's like, wax on, wax on. Show me wax on, wax off, right? Like, we love it in martial arts, but we hate it when it comes to farming. Why? We're inconsistent. But that's how those structures work. Now, if we were perfect people, we wouldn't have to do that. And by the way, that's what the church is supposed to be. In the church, when that happens, and all of us are farming, and he gets it right, and we all mess it up, we turn around and say, let me come help you on your farm, brother, and teach me. And he never has to beat us with a stick, because we're humble, and we're loving, and we care about other people. Okay, too much chat, let's go.
Like other times when we brought up like progressive church, and they're saying, well, we're the ones being more loving with homosexuality. For that, we've ended up saying, well, the people are disagreeing about what God said. So it's like, so why is law of love doesn't work in those situations?
Why do you think it doesn't work in those situations?
People haven't thought it through.
Yeah. But so it's not that it doesn't work, it's that people don't know that it works. That's a different problem. Right. So we turn around and say, like, oh, well, I guess you've said it. You understand. Yes, ma'am. I mean, yes, sir.
You go first.
No, we will defer to you.
It's okay. Go
No.
for it.
Oh, if that was the reason you can't talk, I wouldn't be allowed to talk ever. So go ahead. You're first. He's
Okay.
deferring to you.
So, off what he said, so this is a great plan, when you have both sides working together for the same thing. If they're willing to take you off as an indentured servants and not just kill you, but again, Progressive Church, and I hate to make the distinction, but it is. We're having very, I'm not a feminist, not at all, but we're having a very male viewpoint. Property, this, but a lot of women that I talk to have the viewpoint of do as you would like to be treated, and so it becomes kindness and patience and long suffering to the point where you're taking abuse, which some is allowed. I mean, I'm a mother of small children. I take a lot of abuse. That's part of the job. But it starts to become serving someone else's sin instead of serving God anymore. But those are there for a reason. We still have those things in society.
Yeah.
I'm not just going to sit someone down if they break into my house and try to hurt my children.
Yes.
And say, this isn't what we're supposed to do, but I still love you anyway. I'm going to get the gun upstairs, and I'm going to try to take care of the problem and get one of the kids to call my husband, right?
Right.
Or call the police. So how do you argue these lines? Because these tend to be very, at least my experience, very emotional, heated discussions.
Yes.
Because it gets pulled down into the emotion, and you're being mean, like you said, with the Progressive Church, and it's hard to get out where you're thinking those things through. Can you give me some tools to kind of work through those things?
Yeah, with your permission, and maybe characteristically, I'm going to answer your question slightly indirectly and end it with a question as well. In a marriage, okay, we've already talked about you give up your rights to the other person. Consider it, if you consider it a form of slavery, which I'm using that to say they're both structures that bind. I don't think that there shouldn't be one-to-one, right? A good marriage doesn't look like a good master-slave relationship. I think we can agree with that, right? But the point is that you give up a lot for that other person. When you bind yourself to someone in marriage, that is a huge decision. So one of the things that I don't think that women take responsibility for much today, and gents do the same, but it looks different for both sides, is we are very flip about who we marry. We don't take the decision as seriously as we need to. But what we need to say is, I'm going to bind myself. Like if we looked at it as a form of slavery of like, I'm choosing my master here. Is this a wise master to choose? Like if you looked at it that way and you said, if I was going to make myself a slave to this person, would I be comfortable with this position? When I regarded my wife of like, if I'm going to marry her, the way that I did look at it was like, if we had children in the future, which we did, we had them in the present, but at the time it was in the future. The question I was asking was, if my children are going to be the most precious thing in the world to me, am I picking the world's best mentor, daycare provider, guardian, and example? Right? If I just picked a girl that I thought was the prettiest, or that was the nicest, or that was the most accomplished, and I didn't ask the question of like, well, what's the role one of the roles she's going to play? One of the roles she's going to play is principal in terms of time, raiser of the children. And she should be asking the same of me, is like, is this who I want leading and imitating, and my children imitating? If the answer is not a resounding heck yes, I'd be lucky to have that. Don't get married to him. You're an idiot. Okay, don't do that. So if you end up, the number one thing is, if you end up in a marriage where you're like, this guy ain't doing what he needs to be doing, or this lady is not who she needs to be, then whose fault is that? That's your fault. It's your fault for picking somebody unwisely. Now the question is, are you still bound to your unwise decision? All right, I'll leave that off to the side because it's not actually central to the point. But we have to embrace the fact that some of this is our fault. And if we made bad judgments, you can't just free yourself from it by turning around and being like, oh, that was a bad judgment. Hey, I'm in debt for $500,000. So that was a bad judgment. I recognize that's a bad judgment now. I don't have to pay that back, right? Nope, you borrowed it. It was a bad judgment. I'm glad you realize it now. You're still bound by that debt. Same is true in marriage. So this is why we should be really careful about who we get married to. That's point one. Now, point two. Yes, sir. Oh, you give me the high sign. Thank you. Yeah, I'm almost out of time. So we will pick this up again next time because we won't get far enough into it, and then I also owe you the floor after that. But to sum it up, that's too far down. That's too depressing a point to make. Let me bring it back up a little bit there, which is in the church, which you presumably are, and you find yourself in a marriage where you are unwise. It's not up to you to fix that. Because your husband, or your wife, is subject to the church. And it means that the elders and the deacons and the leaders and the shepherds and the pastors and their peers in the church absolutely should come alongside and fix all of this. Okay, if the church is just a bunch of people who go out to a bunch of different houses and after Sunday they disappear into who knows what black hole and do who knows what, that's a problem. Right? This is why fellowship is important, right? Evil does not flourish in the light. And if we are the light, if the God is the light and he reflects us through prisms like us who are temples of the Holy Spirit, then the more temples of the Holy Spirit running around your house, the less likely there's going to be evil running around the house too. Okay, so the answer to that is be more involved in the church, but be involved in the right kind of church, not ones that are permissive to that kind of bad behavior. Now, if you end up again in a situation where it's difficult, like I guess another thing is when you choose a marriage, when you you're not a feminist, I'm not a feminist either, but I think that I have heard, in fact, without getting into it, because it wasn't somebody from this church, I was called in to help counsel this one couple where the guy was like, I'm the authority, you have to do what I have to say. And the wife, being a good Christian lady, was like, I actually recognize that, but you're a terrible leader and you're a tyrant. Now, by the way, she was not the world's most supportive wife, but her lack of support was in ignorance. She didn't realize what she was doing that was unsupportive. But the bulk of the problem was his. Like 99% of the fault was his. Maybe 90% of the fault, or maybe more. And you could tell when you sat them both down, and a pastor would look at both of them, and he was like, I need you to do this. And she was like, okay. I need you to do this. And he was like, okay. And then he lied about it. Which one of them do you think is really at fault? This guy right here. So in this case, I just want to point out that I do believe that men are given a leadership role in the house. That doesn't make them superior. I've made this point in here. I don't think you were in here. In a special forces team, do you know who the least capable person is on the team? The captain leading it. Every other one of those guys is a specialist. You have a medical specialist, you have a weapons specialist, you have an engineer specialist, you have a comm specialist. These are all specialists. They're all better at their job than the captain is at any one of those individual jobs. But he's still the leader. He's not better than anybody. Nobody thinks it's better than anybody. In the Marine Corps, when you go to lunch, who eats first? The troops. The troops get seconds and thirds before the officers eat. They have to be done before you go and get your food. Yes, it's a model that says the Marines recognize that the combat force is the troops, and that the leaders are there to help the combat force, not for the combat force to serve. A good husband understands the same thing. Okay, so being a leader doesn't mean, like Jesus is a leader of the church, he's washing people's feet, right? So, but it does still mean that you're the leader. So yes, the husband has been made the head of the household, but like we know a Marine officer is a bad officer if he turns around and says, I'm telling you to do that and that's an order. That means he's failed in his leadership because he's failed to inspire his troops to such a degree that they're like, if captains or lieutenants giving us this order, then it's the best thing for me to be doing. Right? So if you have to give that as an order, you fail. The same is true in a marriage. Unless you've got somebody who's so far off the map, they need that kind of help. So we'll get back to your, we'll start with this point next time, but I guess what I wanted to say was we have to recognize, A, that we're part of the problem and haven't made the choice in the first place, but that B, the church is there to help all this stuff. So even in a situation where God has never left us alone, he's always with us, but he also has the people around you right here as part of the problem. So I guess I'll also end on saying this, and that's just an administrative announcement. Please, people in solid ground, don't forget this. If you're we get in here and we have a bunch of intellectual discussions, and this is good for us because everybody in here needs and wants that. But we also recognize that we're humans with needs and we live in the world and whatever else. I would encourage you very, very much that if you have problems in your life, including problems that you're the reason that you have them, please come to the people in solid ground and say, I need help with this. If it's a debt you've contracted and there's nothing you can do about it, but you're like, I shouldn't have done it, okay, fine. We're here to help anyway. And so if we can't help you in those situations, then we're not the church. because we're not treating you like we would want to be treated in the first place. So I say all that to say, this is not just an intellectual discussion group. If you're an atheist, a skeptic, a Buddhist, a Hindu, or whatever else, then yes, it's a discussion group. But for the believers in here, this is your first ring of community. And so if you have something, these should be the people who are helping you out. And if you come to us with a need and we don't help you out, that's not an indictment on you, that's an indictment on all of us, and God will hold us responsible for that, okay? So please, if you have something that you need, I'm begging you, I'm telling you, can I say it? I'm ordering you as the leader of Solid Ground. It's good. To please bring that forward. You can do it to the class, you can do it to any one individual, you can do it to me. But we are here to help because that's what the church should do too. All right. Well, I apologize. This was me talking way more than I should the last time. But I think we have halfway answered your question. We have not completed answering your question. So we'll start with her point next time, and we'll continue answering, hopefully complete answering your question next time. This is an awesome question, by the way. Like if we as Christians can't answer this question, we got a problem. This is something we need to be able to answer because this Bible is not just the New Testament, right? If we don't understand the Old Testament, we got a problem.
I won't be here next week, but can I just leave some questions about interim laws?
Yeah, but do you want us to hold this discussion until you come back?
We can, but if you don't like to talk about it.
Well, we'll pivot to this other one then.
If I can just throw them out.
Shoot.
If we accept that there are some laws, God's laws, that are interim laws, then what are the implications? And so, one, why didn't God say so if that's an interim law? So, why didn't God say, thou shalt not enslave? And then say, but if your heart is so hardened, then at least do this. Why didn't God tell the Israelites that it's a interim law so that for future generations, right, it will be understood that it's an interim law, so that no one take that into the 19th century, make arguments for chattel slavery in the Confederacy.
Yes.
Why did God say so?
Right.
Why did He leave it to us to interpret, which opens up us being sinful, us being self-exalting, trying to, we like to cherry pick the Bible to justify our actions. Well, why did He leave that to us and to theologians to figure out which laws were interim?
Okay.
And two, Jesus said that He's not here to abolish and undo any of the laws. He's
here to fulfill them.
Is that not one of them?
Yes.
So, and three, we don't have to be able to rule this out, but then can we rule out that truly this was not ancient Israelites corrupting God's word, trying to justify their actions and put it in the words of God? Are these in fact still the words of God? Can we deductively prove that? Well, if not, then still it doesn't mean they're not the word of God. We just don't know. We just can't prove that. That it's not the ancient Israelites doing it, but it's still good. And that's really my motivation for talking about this. I want to make sure, if possible, that this wasn't just another ancient culture trying to justify what they do in religious terms.
These are great questions. We will not answer them next time. We'll wait till the week when you come back and answer them, but they're good ones, and yes. And I think, by the way, there's a good answer to all three of them.